This week on the Wake and Bake podcast,
is cannabis being legalized?
I used to get excited about it.
I think what we're trying to do is stop the man from fucking us, really, is what we're trying to do in this podcast today.
If this is now considered a medicine, doctors have zero excuse to not learn about the endocannabinoid system, to not learn about how cannabinoids can affect the body.
If I'm doing this math, you're telling me that they're not doing this math? You're telling me there's not somebody going, oh shit, we lost Corinne Tobias. She was a real cash cow for us.
You're like literally watching me have a live freak out right now.
I didn't mean to bum you out, Andrea.
I'm gonna like go cry into the couch and you're gonna write a really beautifully crafted response.
When you were saying like, we're gonna leave on a funky note, I'm like, actually, I don't think we have to.
Okay, I'm back. I'm back to like being excited.
I think this is a reason, a cause to celebrate. And yeah, maybe we have switched positions a little bit.
So let's get back to fucking the man.
We're not going to fuck the man on this podcast today. I think what we're trying to do is stop the man from fucking us, really, is what we're trying to do in this podcast today. As I've been meditating and walking, I was like, don't rant, don't rant. Don't rant. That's been my mantra. I'm going to struggle because I listened to 3 different podcasts. Like I could only find 3 podcasts on Spotify that covered this at length, and they were all really lacking. And then I went and read the entire thing that we're going to be talking about today, like the entire proposed bill. It is hefty. And then I was like, oh shit, what does this all really mean? There are parts of it that are scary. You know, there are parts of it that, like, when I think about the direction we're moving in, like my initial reaction of like, wait, I don't feel like this is good. It gets more supported the more that I read. So I'm excited to talk about this whole topic because it's important that we talk about it. And like you told me, you're like, this is our job. We need to do this. And I'm kind of like, I don't wanna, I'm going to get so mad. My blood pressure is going to go sky high. I'm gonna have to meditate for 4 hours to calm the fuck down after this. But it's absolutely necessary. And whether or not this enrages you or just gets you on your toes or, you know, like leads you to be able to leave a public comment that changes things, like at least we'll be able to leave this conversation with, you know, listeners knowing what's going on with rescheduling, what it is, and what they can do about it.
Okay, then let's dive in.
Yes, absolutely. I cannot wait to get into this. But first, I think we should introduce ourselves because there might be some new listeners who come to this conversation because they want to know if cannabis is going to be legalized in the US anytime soon. Maybe they want to know what's going on with this whole talk about rescheduling and the DEA and all of this. So we might be new to some people. So why don't you introduce yourself, Andrea?
Sure. I'm Andrea Maharg. I am a cannabis educator for 6 years now. And I am up in Canada where, weirdly enough, this possible rescheduling also impacts us.
I'm Corinne and I'm a United States citizen. So this really impacts us. I've been writing and talking about cannabis for 12 years. I've been a cannabis patient for over 14 years, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And I'm really concerned about this topic. And so if you are new, welcome, but also know that there's all this beautiful stuff that we talk about when we talk about cannabis usually, and we're usually very happy when we get together and talk about cannabis. And this might not be that episode. So if you're brand new to cannabis, maybe start with episode 2, learn why cannabis works, and then come back. I don't want this conversation to scare anyone off because this is like this isn't our most fun conversation. That's for sure.
Yeah, this is like a hefty topic and we're probably not gonna again land on the answer. And we might actually leave this conversation feeling like not great about things. So like we're letting you know that off the top. And this is still so important. You still have to stick around. We still need to talk about why the potential rescheduling of cannabis is going to be impactful for so many people in so many different groups. And that is what we're talking about today is, will cannabis be rescheduled? And when I heard this news, like I think it was 6 weeks ago or so that we heard it. And I've heard this like 1 million times as a Canadian who's waiting for you guys to catch up that like, oh, the laws are changing on cannabis in the States. And I used to get excited about it. But over the years, it just feels like, you know, this is all talk. And this is the first time that things look like they're going to be changing down there with any kind of like actual momentum. Can we talk first about like what scheduling is?
Yeah, let's talk about it. I do want to put the caveat there that we have done this so many times and it almost always correlates with an election cycle. As I was looking through this, it was like 2016 this happened, and so we are at one of those. It does appear that this is going to go through. So let's talk about what rescheduling is. Would you like to talk about some of the history of how cannabis got scheduled with the DEA and what it means?
Yeah, this is like part of my big rant about this just in general is that cannabis was a legal plant medicine that people had access to for thousands of years. And about 100 years ago in the States and worldwide, government started putting restrictions on it and taking it out of the public hands and out of our medicine cupboards and like turning it into a dangerous drug. And cannabis has been out of the hands of Americans basically since the 30s. So annoying that the same people who have like taken it out of public hands, ostensibly because it doesn't have any medical use, it's highly addictive, it's highly unsafe, are now saying, oh, by the way, we think we're going to move this down a couple of categories in with drugs that do have medical uses under doctor supervision. And that's just so annoying to me that we're just listening to these dudes up here who actually probably don't have any idea what they're talking about.
Well, they have an idea what they're talking about. It's been orchestrated since the beginning to get this very dangerous drug, out of the hands of the people for a really long time for a whole bunch of nefarious reasons, which we can talk about in a different podcast. But when it comes to scheduling, cannabis, since you and I have been alive, has been a Schedule 1 drug classification where there's absolutely no medical use and a high probability for abuse, right? So it's highly addictive and it's not good for anyone. The proposed change is moving that to a Schedule 3, like you said, which is a pharmaceutical controlled substances category, which includes things like codeine, ketamine, anabolic steroids. Those are the ones that are really well known. And these are all doctor supervised, doctor prescribed drugs. So we're moving this plant medicine that obviously should have never been a Schedule 1 drug into Schedule 3. And I think what's interesting about this is that when I first heard it, and I know when so many of you first heard it, you were like, wait, why are we moving it to Schedule 3? Why can't we just decriminalize it, legalize it, deschedule cannabis, right? That was the first thing I said. I was like, well, if it's not descheduled, I don't want to talk about it. I don't care. And what was interesting in unwinding this is realizing that, again, those same people who pushed cannabis to be included as a very dangerous drug here, they also pushed to be included in these treaty organizations, the UN, their convention on narcotics 60 years ago to include cannabis. And the reason that we can't deschedule, the reason we can't legalize federally, in theory, is because we're trying to abide by that treaty. I'm pretty sure you guys in Canada are also on that treaty, though. So I'm a little bit like, is this just kind of a red herring or whatever? Like, we can't because of the treaties. We would love to, but we can't because of the treaties. But the UN's not coming for Canada. You don't see blue helmets invading you guys because you guys have legalized cannabis. So is that bogus?
I think like that is something that's at play when they're thinking about like, hey, just descheduling because the US pushed for this legislation to go out worldwide, like for them to all of a sudden back right off and say, hey, something that we said was as dangerous as heroin, now we're cool with. So I think there is some of that, but I think that the reason that this is going from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 is actually much darker and deeper than that. And you guys aren't really giving a shit what the rest of the world thinks about cannabis. I think that this has to do with big business.
We're going to get into that, whether or not this is a move by big business, by big pharma, by corporate cannabis, who benefits by this. Before we get any further into the weeds here, if you are also so frustrated about the lack of education, please check out our Certified Cannabis Educator program at cannabiscoachinginstitute.com. The Certified Cannabis Educator program is now internationally accredited by the International Practitioners of Holistic Medicine, and it is a 6-month program, but you can get it done in as little as 3 months. You will have that extra support so that you can be in community as you start getting out into the world and telling people how incredible this plant can be. We'll show you how to write books and blogs, how to create podcasts and videos for YouTube, how to host workshops and retreats, and more. So if you know that you're feeling the call to work with this plant and make sure that people know how incredible it is, go to cannabiscoachinginstitute.com and we will see you there. All right, now let's get back into the weeds. Let's talk about what rescheduling would mean, because I think it's important for us, especially after reading the entire proposed bill, to share what we've learned that's actually in the bill, because there's so many people that were talking about this for like a week and then people stopped talking about it. And when I looked back on the things that people were saying about it, it was quite misleading. Like, oh, now it's going to be legalized everywhere, or oh, they're going to shut down all of the state-run programs. And people were extrapolating all of this stuff from not reading the bill. I think like they would read the AP article and draw their conclusions from there. So I want to talk about what it actually means. So Andrea, from what you've learned about this bill so far, what would it do? What would it change?
It would mean a bunch of different things would change. We don't have answers to all the questions, but here are some like main highlights. It would be accepted as a medicine with potential medical benefits, as opposed to this like scary drug that it's been classified as for so long. Importantly, for cannabis patients around the world, it would open up research in the United States about cannabis. And that is so important because although loads and loads of research has been done in the States on cannabis, most of the focus was what is wrong with this plant? How will it hurt us? How will it kill us? What are all the bad things that are going to happen with it? Whereas in other centers around the world, Canada, Spain, Israel, they've been doing research on the medical benefits of cannabis, but without the huge capacity, both financial wise and science wise, that you guys have in the States. You have those two things where you can really make a huge difference in worldwide cannabis knowledge now that researchers are not going to have such a hard time studying the plant. So for me, that's huge. Another big one is that healthcare practitioners will now be able to legally prescribe cannabis. Before, the daring doctors would do something called recommending cannabis, but they couldn't write it on their prescription pad. And I know this brings up, I know your alarm bells are going off like, it's turning into a prescription med. But in my opinion, if this is now considered a medicine, doctors have zero fucking excuse to not learn about the endocannabinoid system, to not learn about how cannabinoids can affect the body. If you're still a doctor in 2024, as this is being rescheduled, saying like, no, I'm not interested in learning about this, like, get a new doctor, people, like get a new doctor. Along those same lines, insurance companies might be able to cover it because it's a medicine. One of the big things is that cannabis businesses aren't going to be subject to these really harsh tax penalties that they have been for all these years. So, that's a really big win for big cannabis over there.
Can I please? I've been so good, but I have some things to say about this because those are all good points. Wow, what a beautiful world you're painting here, where doctors are going to learn about cannabis and the endocannabinoid system. They're going to take the time to understand the most dynamic system in the human body. They're going to take the time to learn about the most dynamic plant medicine that exists on all of planet Earth. And cannabis companies and little mom and pop dispensaries will have a fair playing ground because they won't have to take on this unfair tax burden that can be up to 70%. I love this world that you're painting. However, I just want to pause really quick and remind you that they are classifying cannabis as a pharmaceutical, which means that a lot of these changes, if not all of them, will only apply to FDA approved drugs, right? This only applies if it is FDA approved. All Schedule 3 drugs go through an FDA approval process, which takes a very long time. I looked up the little chart of how to get a Schedule 3 drug approved by the FDA. Yeah. They have a nice little infographic. And it's like, you apply, then you do the animal studies, then you do the longer application, then you have 3 different tiers of human clinical trials that you have to go through. And then you go through another part of the process, right? This is a super long, very intensive process that will likely result in very expensive drugs like Marinol. We already know about that. It's already passed this process. It is, anywhere from $200 to $800 a month. It has these side effects that cannabis doesn't have, which can include creating seizures and seizure-like symptoms. When we're talking about all of these implications, even the tax one, is that going to apply for companies that have FDA-approved products? We are putting this in a category that has to be approved by the FDA. The FDA It's an interesting entity. And historically, at least in the past 20 years, it has been run by someone. The commissioner of the FDA has historically been someone who had deep ties to the pharmaceutical industry, right? Right now, our really cute commissioner, he's so cute. He wears bow ties and he reminds me of Rick Steves. And I was like, oh, maybe this guy's a chill dude. And then I started going down the rabbit hole. And even Democrats in our country, the same party that put him into his spot there as commissioner, said they really weren't sure if they wanted to because of his ties to the pharmaceutical industry and its potential hand in the opioid crisis. We're putting this on his desk. And granted, we might have a changing of the guard and all those things, but the last chairman of the FDA ties to Pfizer. And the FDA is over 50% funded by the pharmaceutical industry in the form of user fees. So these fees that they charge when they're applying for these types of drugs and going through this process of getting their drugs approved, they pay into the FDA, and over half of the FDA's budget is now coming from big pharma. My concern is that some of these good things that we're talking about here and that we'll talk about might only apply to FDA approved drugs. I just wanted listeners to know that, because as we continue to go through this and some of the concerns that you've had that you've sent into us as listeners, and some of the concerns that we have and things that we want to add into the public comment, that's one thing. That's like one lens that I want us to be able to look through is this going to have to be FDA approved from now on, every cannabis product?
You're like literally watching me have a live freak out right now. You and I have talked about this so many times in the past little bit, and I don't think I fully understood that doctors recommending, insurance companies covering, being able to show up on federal property with your medicine, all of these things. I don't think I fully went down the path far enough to realize you have been right this whole time. It's not cannabis, the plant, that's moving from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. The stuff that's going to be in Schedule 3 is going to be isolated molecules, pharmaceutical creations. And we know from many, many, many studies that when people take cannabis as a whole plant, that it works so much more efficaciously. It's like night and day between isolates and whole plant. These aren't the same things anymore, right? Oh God, I'm actually freaking out, CT.
Okay, well, let's talk about it, because
Wow.
I agree. I've been freaking out for weeks, and I'm now more chill, right? I've been doing my I'm not going to rant mantra, but I do want to make sure that we think about it through that lens, because we are talking about different things, and in the bill itself, it says that we're talking about different things, that we're not talking about flower that you smoke. That has been fascinating to me, that it's much more likely going to be concentrates and plant-derived medicines. So you're not going to get a doctor who's like, hey, you should smoke some Alaskan Thunderfuck. And that's fine. I think that's fine. And I don't think it would be ideal to have doctors out there being like, hey, here's a vape pen and here's, smoke this flower. And, like the same things that we have with bud tenders. I think there is a path forward where we're evolving and where these two things are coming together, but this doesn't seem like that path forward for me. So again, I just wanted you to keep that in mind, that when we're talking about this, it does require FDA approval. And well, theoretically, everything is theoretical. I think that's just necessary that we have that foundation of understanding that they're classifying cannabis as a pharmaceutical.
The thing that has been exciting me so much is the possibility of US researchers getting their hands on this plant. But if they're getting their hands on this plant so that they can isolate a new cannabinoid and turn it into a pharmaceutical medicine, we're not actually going to be learning more about what the plant does in our bodies.
Hang on a second, because if you think of the research that we have already, we've been able to say go to Cannakeys, and there were companies that wanted to create products that were funding this research, and that's available to us. And we wouldn't know about things like CBG and CBD largely otherwise.
You're right. A lot of what we know about CBD, for example, is because of Epidiolex. I'm just grappling with the fact of moving full force down a pharma lane of cannabis rather than still including the whole plant, how most people would prefer to consume it. You know this about me, the listeners don't, but I'm very Pollyanna, right? I'm always like, let's put a nice spin on things and la-di-da. I will still come out of this conversation and try to have a silver lining because that's who I am as a person. But I am much, much more cynical now after just hearing you talk about this. It makes me so angry.
And I'll link this below, the process for FDA approving a Schedule 3 drug, so you can see what that looks like from the FDA. Is each ratio going to go through that entire process, each tincture formulation? That's going to make things so much more expensive. And when I think about what a nightmare that is to lose some incredible products, when I think about Dr. Bonnie Goldstein and the products that she recommends and those things going away for kids with epilepsy and childhood cancer and autism and, like the lack of availability and we'll have to wait and see if there's a product that's going to be available to help these kids without unnecessary side effects, that is concerning to me for sure. But look, this whole structure, when we think about it and the way they're doing things, makes sense because the FDA and pharma, they're going to lose if the legalization process that's currently gripping our nation and going state by state and that's creating these new industries and creating medicine that ostensibly helps people, right? You can look at the literature and you look at what people say about how cannabis is helping them. And you'll see that, if that continues, they're in trouble, right? Because I want to use a real life example on how much money they lose when a person with a chronic condition like me, I'm going to use myself as a real life example because it was easy for me to do the math on this one. When I exited the medical industry, right, which I was in for about 6-7 years with different chronic conditions, specifically chronic pain and then other related things. And I was sick all the time. And I kept going back to the doctor and they kept doing all sorts of things like giving me 3 months of antibiotics and opiates and anti-inflammatories, antidepressants, Ritalin, Adderall, I can keep going on. They just kind of kept adding to it because every time I'd come back in, I go, well, now I feel weird in this way. And they're like, here's another one, right? It's a classic story, tale as old as time. And when I started looking into this, like the cost, I was thinking about the cost the insurance companies had to have been paying, right? Because I was under my parents' insurance. I was relatively young. What I found out was that the average is $8,000 extra dollars a year for someone with a chronic pain condition. So $8,000 a year. And when I switched to plants, fungi, lifestyle, spirituality, self-care, right? I did the math and they, in the 14 years that I've been doing that, have lost $114,000 from just me, from just little me. And then I did the math on how much it costs me to use cannabis the way that I use it, which is now with FICO. Shout out to Skagit Organics and their amazing FICO, which is about $60 a month. In that same 15 years, I would spend $8,000. That's a huge difference in cost. Yeah. And they are losing, when cannabis is legalized medically or otherwise in places, we know that opiates go down. We know that alcohol loses. We know that everything else loses when cannabis enters the scene. And that's without people even really knowing how to use it well, right? Like it took me years to figure out how to use it well and to do it in a way where it continually makes me feel better. Like I feel better year over year when I look back. And pharmaceuticals, I haven't heard of a story, but I don't believe that pharmaceuticals do that. They don't make you feel better and better and better over time. And so, yeah, that's a big loss. I see why they would structure it in this particular way.
Yeah. And when you're talking about all these alcohol, drug use going down in states when they legalize, that's because people are smoking the plant, they're eating the plant, they're putting the plant on their body. It's not because they're popping a CBN isolate pill at night. They're using the whole plant.
Most of the time. I mean, sometimes the people who are doing it and doing it well, but like, think about it. Again, if I'm doing this math, you're telling me that they're not doing this math. You're telling me there's not somebody going, oh shit, we lost Corinne Tobias. She was a real cash cow for us. Fuck, what is she using instead? Magic mushrooms and cannabis? Uh-oh. Better put a lockdown on this. I don't mean to be so flippant about it, but in so many ways, I'm like, I don't want it to come across like this is a conspiracy against patients. But when I think about what this means for patients and access and actual real information and education, this doesn't do what I think so many people think it's going to do. And we'll talk about later about people being like, well, it'll make the stigma better. Like, I disagree with that. I think it's just, we're going along this line where we're separating whole plant medicine and pharmaceuticals. And doctors are going to learn about that pharmaceutical from a pharmaceutical rep. You think most doctors are going to go deeper than that? No, the awesome doctors who are already awesome and curious, they've had access to this information. They've learned about it. They've like incorporated it. Yes, there will be more of those, but there were going to be more of those anyway. Do you know what I mean? Like, to me, it's so frustrating that this became the focus of this administration instead of the UN treaty. Because if we would have changed that, then we could, really make effective change here that doesn't make cannabis a pharmaceutical.
I think for me, it comes back to like where we were at the top, that over the years, we've heard many times, like something's going to happen with the US government and cannabis. And this just in my 6 years, but one of my passions in the cannabis space is learning about the history of this plant. And if you look at cannabis activists over the years, we have had many times where we're like, woohoo, we're winning. And then it turns out that we're not. And this for me for a long time felt like, woohoo, we're winning. We're getting closer. The stigma is going to be reduced, etc. And it now really feels like we're talking again about two totally different things.
Yeah, we are. We are absolutely talking about two totally different things. I didn't mean to bum you out, Andrea. I really didn't.
Let me put my Pollyanna hat back on then. Okay. So when we originally decided that we were going to do this podcast, I reached out to the Cannabis Coaching Institute list and I said, hey, Corinne and I are going to talk about this. I'm on the fence. She is not. What do you think about it? And so we had lots of people writing in, giving positives and negatives. The passion in our listeners and our readers, like, thank you so much. And if you're not already on that list, head to cannabiscoachinginstitute.com and get yourself signed up so you can be part of the conversation. And for me, this was always like, this is a step in the right direction. And even as we have this conversation here, I'm still going to stick to a little bit of a Pollyanna view. Let's say that your like worst nightmare dystopian future comes true and we are going down this road where we're pulling cannabis back out of the hands of people and putting it only in pharmacies, and its use and access is significantly limited. At the same time, the rest of the world is watching the powerhouse United States, who originally instigated worldwide prohibition-ish, back down on their stance against it. And does that allow this wave of global legalization to move more quickly? I think it still does. I think that this can mean great things for cannabis worldwide. And I think that if we get enough people out there talking about this, learning about this, reading about this, screaming about it from the top of the rooftops, maybe in another election cycle or 2 or 3 or 10, maybe something else happens, because the rest of the world isn't going to treat cannabis the same way that big pharma is trying to treat it in the States. And maybe even that statement is Pollyanna of me.
No, I don't think that's it. Let's talk about not my worst nightmare coming true. It's not just my worst nightmare. It's just a nightmare. It's a potential nightmare. But like, what if both are true, right? What if they go, okay, we're not going to really mess with what the states are doing, but we're going to create this framework for cannabis to be prescribed, and these FDA approved drugs to take off. And we're going to do that. Well, really, that is creating more access to cannabinoids and to cannabinoid based therapy. If you think about it that way, I know from now 12 years of experience of making medicine, of learning about it, sharing it with others, that there are a subset of people who, no matter what I say or what we do, are not going to listen to me when it comes to cannabis and using cannabis as medicine. I know that. But would they listen to their doctor? Would they take an FDA tested single molecule thing that makes them feel better? Yeah, of course they would. And so that could create a way for people to supplement their endocannabinoid system using these things without having to go into alternative medicine. I know you don't have to make that face. There are some people who want to choose that, who believe in the way that Western medicine approaches things for conditions, right? And that really have a hard time thinking that this plant that's been villainized and stigmatized for so long could benefit them in a way. And they're definitely not going to listen to me like barefoot making stuff in my kitchen, like, hey, everybody, like, let's take more CBD. Like they're just people who only listen to their doctors when it comes to this kind of stuff. And I think honoring both paths would be amazing. Again, my fear is that one path will begin to override and strong arm the other path. But what if instead of a nightmare, there is a Pollyanna, like, hey, everyone has different options to access this plant in the way that they want to. And when you're talking about the FDA, at least it is regulated. And you're not going to get something with heavy metals and all of these things that we contend with in the cannabis industry that are actual problems. And so when you were like, we're going to end at a place where you kind of feel icky about it, I'm like, well, let's manifest something else. Like, let's talk about different ways to navigate this issue. Like, when we first started doing this, the thing that popped into my head was like, well, if we're going to reclassify things, let's reclassify sugar. Like, remember when I started going on this thing and I was like, if we're in our reclassification era, like liquid sugar kills just as many people as cocaine in the United States every year, right? There's data. You guys go look it up. Maybe I'll put a link below if I remember to do it. It has no medical use. It's intoxicating. It's incredibly addictive. So if this is about consumer protection and if this is about public health, like, let's go. Let's reclassify sugar. That should be a Schedule 1. And it was a little tongue in cheek, but the more I kind of think about this issue, I am thinking about like what kinds of conversations this might trigger if it passes, if it actually goes through, what people will talk about. How are we going to start looking at these compounds differently? How are we going to look at addiction differently? Like maybe it does open up a conversation that goes a little bit deeper than this. And maybe it's forced us all to really take a good hard look at where this is all going and where it is. Because we've been kind of complacent here in the US and just letting shit like Delta 8 fly for so long. It's like maybe this is now time to start looking at things a little more critically and to be making some decisions about how we're going to protect consumers and patients.
And you made a really good point about people are going to have access to cannabinoids if it's through their doctor, if it's through a pharmaceutical, and those will help with many conditions. Like maybe people are going to be able to feel better with the power of the plant removed, like a step away or something.
My hope is that like people start taking it and then they become open to like, oh, this works for me. And now I've heard that this other thing that I can grow in my backyard works and I'm not so scared of it anymore. And that is the concern for me is where this lands for incarceration, expungement, home grows, and patient access and education. Like there are valid concerns there.
I did some reading about whether this was going to make a difference for people who are incarcerated currently for low-level cannabis crimes. And that's not part of this rescheduling conversation at all. And if they're rescheduling the cannabis plant down to cannabis molecules, like people don't go to jail because they're like hawking CBD isolate on the street. So it doesn't feel like that's going to go anywhere either. I had people writing in saying, this is going to change things for me. One of those things was stigma. And you said a little bit ago, you're like, I don't think that's going to make a difference. Can you talk more about that?
I mean, that's our goal, right? As cannabis educators, one of our biggest missions is to use education to reduce stigma and reduce fear around this plant. But over, again, this last 12, 13, however many years it's been, if we learned anything, is that it takes years of access to this plant and information to do the work of reducing stigma and fear. And I have doubts that this change is going to make a significant impact in that. Like we just said, maybe if there's access and people are being prescribed it by their doctors in certain ways, yeah, probably. But will people still think a stoner's a stoner and that like Harold and Kumar and Cheech and Chong and all of those things are still a part of especially smoking cannabis? I don't think this is going to change that at all. And it's certainly not going to change it as much of an impact as would have been made if we would have gone straight to the source and worked on the UN treaty and made real moves towards decriminalization, expungement, reparations, protecting home grows, budgeting for education. What do you think?
I can speak to the other side of that because we're 6.5 years out right now of legalizing and the conversations are really changing. I talk about cannabis all the time and it used to be like people would give me like weird looks when I would talk about it. And now when I'm being hesitant about it sometimes or like not being my full shouting from the rooftop self, other people are stepping in and saying, but cannabis is like not harmful at all. It's a really great medicine. It helps me sleep. My mom's trying it. The conversation is really shifting around people who don't choose to consume it, maybe never will, don't have an interest in it, but still are seeing it as a medicine or even just as a fun way to relax on a Friday night without some of the downfalls of alcohol. And that is because it's fully legalized here. So I think that is going to need to happen for a big sea change in the States to happen as well with stigma.
I'm so curious about that because if you're in a state where it's legal, my assumption is like, well, why does it make that big of a difference? You think as a nation, if the whole nation goes, then it changes the whole conversation. Yeah?
I
All right.
do.
Okay.
I really do.
All right. I want to know. I would love to find out. Please, let's go. Love to know if the United States would legalize, if that would make it easier for someone to come and ask me a question about cannabis when they're suffering with something. Let's talk about a couple of other things that we heard from people who wrote in. Someone wrote in who was a patient and who works for the federal government. And he was like, yeah, I'm going to be able to use my medicine, or I'm going to be able to go out and have a fun Friday night. And that's going to be okay. I'm not going to lose my job. And currently he says that he can have his person or car searched at any time on federal property. And again, my argument for that is going to be that's probably only going to be a federally approved product, an FDA approved product.
Yeah, that was Mike. And I was excited for Mike when he wrote in and said that he was excited. And I hadn't considered that, of course, he's not going to be able to have his Blue Dream or whatever on property. He's going to be able to have his bottle of Marinol caps, for example. What else stood out to you in our feedback?
Yeah, the other thing that stood out to me in the feedback was Lindy, and this one made me sad when I was looking at it through this frame, because she said she's currently not only a prisoner of her disease, but she's also a prisoner of the law that doesn't recognize her medicine, and so she can't travel across state lines, even from one legal state to another. And again, like when I was like, yeah, except you're still not going to be able to unless it's Marinol or something that gets approved. And that might take a long time, and that might be really expensive medicine. And we don't know whether or not insurance companies are going to start covering that type of medicine. We just really, there are so many unknowns. And is it going to work best for you? Or are you going to actually need a formulation? I just want to hug her because I'm like, I understand that you're excited about this, but it's not what it means, at least yet. At least that's not what we're seeing. I wanted to be excited for her too. And honestly, Andrea, the only argument for a potential benefit that somewhat resonates with me is that argument that we need more regulation for products in the cannabis and hemp markets, right? Like I heard it time and time again as I was listening to podcasts and reading things about this issue. People bring up the very, very real problem that we have in cannabis, which is that you don't know how many cannabinoids and how many milligrams are in certain products. And lab testing is bullshit, and they're heavy metals. And we just don't know what's in these products. And that's a very real concern. And there's a very real concern with things like Delta 8 and all these franking cannabinoids and how they impact our health and what's actually in those products, especially when you put them into a vaporizer. You know, we did an episode on vaping cannabis, and we were both pretty struck by what we found there. And we absolutely need research and reform around these things. Again, unfortunately, and I want to give myself a big hug here, we probably won't get those things out of this particular change. And so there is like hope for me that this does open up research. I don't care who it's funded by at this point. I'll take whatever research we can be getting about these cannabinoids and especially these methods of consumption, because the market itself can't be trusted to regulate and make a safe consumer product. So there has to be something there. But I just don't know if this is going to move us in that direction.
And there is a way to do this so that cannabis can still be a medicine and be accessed by people, and we can research it, and doctors can prescribe it, and people can use it on a Saturday night for fun. And that is to legalize it or deschedule it altogether and create new regulations where products are, universally tested, et cetera. So that is an option. It's not the option that the US is considering right now. And we should talk about whether we have a voice outside of like yelling into our microphones or, screaming at your best friend. We don't want to leave listeners of this podcast feeling all the feels and not having an outlet. So it is possible to make comments on this potential rescheduling, and it is the government's responsibility to read these comments and respond to them, not respond to individual comments, but to respond to concerns, questions, et cetera, that the public bring up in the public commenting period. Whether or not this has the potential to like change this rescheduling or, you know, stop this regulation change in its tracks? Probably not. But again, and I'm thinking long term here, having this conversation now, writing your thoughts and explaining to them how this potential change could impact you, putting links to studies that show that whole plant cannabis is more efficacious than isolates. I think doing this work and just having your voice heard is important right now. So we will leave a link down below for how to do that. How much of an impact that's going to make, we're not really sure.
I have a lot to say about this, actually. When you were saying like, we're going to leave on a funky note, I'm like, actually, I don't think we have to, because I think it's more than it's a good exercise for you to do it. And let's just see how it works. One of the things that we need to note here, and this was from the policy change stuff directly from the government, is that yes, they are obligated to review the comments. I do want you to remember that these are public comments. And so if you need to use a pseudonym or be anonymous, there are options for that as well. But the DEA is not obligated to change the public policies the way that they're wanting to roll them out due to, quote, mass sentiment. So yelling into the comment box, hoping that enough people are saying the same thing, isn't the tactic here. They are apparently, allegedly, looking for thoughtful alternatives and input. So sending your best proposal, your most well-researched, eloquent proposal for what you would like to see as a concerned citizen, as a patient, as a professional, and keeping in mind that descheduling is likely off the table just because of what we talked about before. I really think that there's something powerful in you putting that together. If you're going to publicly comment, you might as well publicly share your statement with the people you love, whether or not they're blowing smoke. The process of us coming up with alternatives and sharing them publicly and with each other, I think that that is a conversation we need to have. If you're going to publicly comment, including things like release and expungement and reparations, protecting home grows, making sure that people can grow their own medicine, and affordability, right? Making sure that it's covered by insurance or made affordable. I think that those are some really important issues that we could all touch on. Again, will it change the policy the way that it's written out now? No, but will it make us more eloquent when we continue to speak about this as things continue to move forward and change? Yeah, I think it will. So I'm hopeful.
Okay, so we did switch positions. I'm gonna like go cry into the couch, and you're you're gonna write a really beautifully crafted response.
I don't think we should cry. I think we should celebrate the fact we get to have this conversation. Remember that you and I are standing on the backs of all of the people who couldn't have this conversation publicly. And if they did, they could go to jail for holding a joint, right? Like we have this like incredible privilege to be having this conversation. And that's because of the work that people did and because of the conversations that people had for years that this bullshit has been going on. And so I think this is a reason, a cause to celebrate. And yeah, maybe we have switched positions a little bit because I'm not celebrating this move to Schedule 3, but I am celebrating the fact that we can comment and that we do have access and we can continue to fight for this plant and the people it helps most. Like if people wouldn't have done that before, we wouldn't know what we know now about how incredible this plant is, which like that has taken us years to uncover for ourselves. It's going to take years for the public to catch up. And it's already happening faster than I ever imagined it would. I'm only 38. Like, I really didn't think that this plant would be legal until I died.
Okay, I'm back. I'm back to like being excited with the power that we have as educators, as people who are really passionate about this plant. We haven't even mentioned the Cannabis Coaching Institute yet, but this is what we do over there is train people so that they're super well educated and they know how to speak with the public about this. So if you're listening to this and you're like, yes, like let's talk more about cannabis, you are probably already one of us, and you should check out cannabiscoachinginstitute.com because this conversation needs to continue to happen.
I know you were really bummed out, but I also want to say to dear listeners, it's usually not a bummer. It's usually pretty magical, the stuff that you get to share with people. And so this isn't a good introduction to what becoming a certified cannabis educator is all about. You can write blogs, you can post recipes, you can have fun with it. You can also tackle some serious subjects and be able to go toe to toe with other people who have different views with you and respectfully explore those views, and I think that that's that's also pretty fun, honestly. All right, everybody, thank you so much for listening. We really appreciate you so much. Please let us know what you think, what came up for you during this podcast. Send us any thoughts or comments you have either below, wherever you're listening to it or watching it, or email us at support@wakeandbake.co. We love hearing from you, and we are so grateful that we got to be here with you today.
See you next time.